Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on inequality and difference. Today we are going to talk on one of the another important topics, and our topic of discussion is colonial policy towards tribal and pastoral nomads. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Shruti Vip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Vip is a prolific professor, and through her we always get more and more of knowledge on various issues and topics. So now I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Shruti Vip and would request her to explain us in detail the today's lecture. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Geetika. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. It's my pleasure to be on this platform and share whatever little knowledge I have on the topic. So today we would be talking about both colonial as well as post-colonial policy towards the tribal groups, and this is specifically with reference to the forest use and the land use that was made by the tribals. So before we proceed further, I shall like to just reflect on the various themes that we have picked up so far. So we have discussed at length on the issues related to class, caste, and then we are now presently focusing our discussion on the tribals, because these are some of the marginalized groups, and they must be discussed in greater detail, their marginalization, the causes of marginalization, and what are the solutions to the problem of their marginalization needs greater attention, and therefore it cannot be covered as part of one generalized topic as part of inequality and difference. So therefore there is a need to undertake a detailed discussion with specific reference to tribal groups. So the most important theme that one has to take up when one is talking about the tribals is how their resource base is getting eroded, and how there is always a challenge between the people and the resources. So when I say people, it definitely means non-tribals, it means the wider civilization, the country at large, which needs the resources which are more or less found in the areas that are inhabited by the tribals. So therefore there is definitely a struggle that has been going on since time immemorial between the resources that are found in the tribal areas in the form of various minerals, metal deposits, mines, etc., and of course timber and forest resources on the one hand, and then tribal habitat on the other hand, which is invariably found in thick forests, hills, etc. So therefore there is a contrast that exists between the more or less subsistence economy, a more or less non-monetized economy that was prevalent in the tribal areas on the one hand, and a highly accumulative economy of the non-tribal areas that was prevalent, and that is very much prevalent today in rest of the areas. So therefore while the tribals can be described as communities who were living in smaller units, and they were tightly knit by kinship, marriage ties, by the ties of locality, as well as labor pooling customs, but then this category of population can definitely be differentiated from the non-tribals, who are always leading settled life, and they are not always on the move just like the tribals, either in search of hunting or gathering or slash and burn agriculture. So therefore the tribals since time immemorial have been fierce defenders of their resource bases, Now, that is another part of the story, and that is a tragic part of the story as well, that they have not really succeeded in face of modern civilization, the so called modern civilization, in defending their habitat, which especially after the phase of globalization and even before that, with the onset of industrialization, gradually there was a shift of the habitat, and the land started passing away from their hands to the non-tribals. Then so whatever resources which were very crucial to their livelihoods gradually either were getting eroded, or the control of the tribals to over these resources was petering down. So therefore, the larger social structure and the egalitarian social structure that was associated with the tribal society started also undergoing a change and a transformation, and the process did not begin only after independence. In fact, it had begun much earlier in the course of 17th, 18th century, especially during 18th century with the influx of the colonial regime in the tribal areas, and this aspect I had already discussed in the last lecture. So now when in today's lecture I would specifically be focusing on colonial policy in tribal areas, especially with reference to the forest rights. Now here a very important role was played by the creation of a formal forest department. So once this took off, then there was no looking back, and the rigid regulation over forest use and a complete control and ban over free movement of goods and services in the tribal areas came into force. So therefore, the search for timber due to rising demand for shipping in order to meet colonial demand, as well as railways and a number of other construction activities that had started in a big way during 19th century, especially after the second half of 19th century, created huge demand for timber, and this could be met from the forest areas which were under the tribals. So therefore, it was very important to lay down strict rules and regulations, and therefore a forest department was considered as need of the hour. Now, in addition to this, there was another change that had come about with the introduction of the colonial rule in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, and a number of tribal areas that were located in these states. Came to experience new land revenue settlements like the zamindari settlement, and with the introduction of the so called permanent land revenue system in these areas, there was definitely alienation of land from the tribal groups to the non-tribals. And as I had discussed in the last lecture, with the incoming of Dikus in the Chota Nagpur region, for example, the Dikus were the outsiders who came to play a very important role not only as money lenders but also as zamindars and jagidars in these areas, and therefore they started getting control over land, and they also started forcing tribals to perform bigar for them. So therefore, the exploitation that had begun much earlier saw no turning back, and it continued unabated. So therefore, with the new land revenue settlements like zamindari, mahalwari and rayatwari, the traditional rights of the tribals over their land started giving way to the rights of the newly emerging class of outsiders in their areas. So, and with this also started the introduction of non-tribal communities who started settling down in their areas, and also they were the ones who started facilitating the colonial policies. They were the ones who became agents of change, and they were the ones who were going to facilitate more and more colonial penetration in these areas. So therefore, the tribals were gradually getting pushed out from the tribal areas, from the forest areas. They were either migrating to plains, or they were forced to work as indentured labor or in the plantation economy. And with this, another process that started was that they started migrating to even far more inaccessible areas, to upper hilly ranges, where the colonial reach was still out of bound. So therefore, the out migration began, and the process continued from 19th, 20th centuries onwards. And now this was not the only reaction, that is out migration, or just surrendering in front of the outsiders or the colonial regime. Another reaction was, of course, rebellion, and there are a series of tribal rebellions that one can talk of, again from late 18th century, and so even before 1857 revolt, one can talk of a series of tribal revolts that had occurred as a reaction against both the outsiders as well as against the colonial policy of land grabbing, the new administrative system that had been introduced in their areas, and also the new land revenue settlements. So therefore, the series of rebellions that took place prior to 1857 need equal and rather more attention of scholars and historians, because they also can be considered as the initial wars against the colonial rule. And it was not as if 1857 was the first kind of a reaction that the Indians provided towards that the Indians projected against the colonial regime. So now, having discussed the brief background, I would like to bring your attention to how the tribes were located, and they were found in different areas. You can all look at the slide that is being showed. In this map of India, you can see that the northwestern part of India at that time was largely inhabited by the Afghan, Gujar and Lohani tribes, whereas in the middle, in the central India, you could talk about Gonds, and then towards the western portion, one can talk about Bhils, and the south were Bedars, whereas in the northeast and in the region around Chota Nagpur region, you can talk about Santals, and of course Gujars and Bhatis again in the region around Rajasthan and Gujarat. So therefore, with this kind of territorial distribution of tribes, it was not one or two specific areas that the colonial regime could describe as the tribal areas, because they were spread over a fairly wider region, as you have seen in this map. Now, another interesting way of understanding tribal conflict during colonial period would be to look at another slide which shows the zones of conflict. Now, why there were so many zones of conflict? Because of course, due to the resources that were available in these local regions. So, for example, in the central India, timber was the most important resource that was available, and as I have just told you that this was in great demand from third or fourth decade of 19th century onwards, due to increasing expansion of shipping as well as railways that was envisaged for. Then mining was also a very important activity that had to be carried on in the tribal areas. Then in the south, you can see that it was not only timber industry, but also plantation economy in the form of tea, coffee plantations, and then tea plantations again in the northeastern part of the country, and then a number of irrigation projects that had to be planned, and also extension of farming that was always on the cards, because the colonial regime was always in favor of extension of farming at the cost of at the cost of wasteland or at the cost of forest areas, because these irrigated fields and agricultural areas were going to bring profit to them in the form of land revenue, whereas the area which was not under cultivation was of no use to them. So, the colonial rulers had complete disregard for the diversity of land use, diversity in land use that was prevalent in India, and they just wanted a monoculture kind of development, that was basically agricultural kind of development, and that too not with any intention of increasing production of food grains in order to feed the teeming millions, but rather to bring in more and more area under cultivation, so that settled life can start in these areas, and the people can be brought under the gambit of law and order, and they would start roaming around from one place to another and create mischief, because according to them the tribal groups were no less than mischief makers or rebels, and they definitely wanted to change this situation. So, therefore, it is interesting to understand as to what was the meaning of tribal in colonial discourse, because the way colonial administrators described a tribal and they defined a tribal was quite different from what actually was the reality. So, therefore, the colonial administrators in a number of writings, they used to differentiate the groups that in the government's observation did not follow Hindu caste rules. So, any community which was not following caste rules, which was outside the Brahmanical social order, was described as a non-tribal, then as a tribal. Then also this definition covered a range of unrelated communities. For example, those who were not following settled life, for example, the pastoral nomads who used to move about from one place to another along with their herds, and then there were the Afghans and also the forest dwellers. So, these three categories were considered as belonging to the larger subgroup of tribals and nomads. Then a range of values were also ascribed to these groups, and most of these values largely proclaimed that how they were beyond law and how it was very important to bring them within the ambit of law and order, so as to create a more conducive environment for colonial rule. Now, a number of values or stereotypes were also associated with the term tribal. So, and these stereotypes, one can go through a number of colonial sources in order to understand their relevance to the topic. So, for example, the colonial administrators or ethnographers, they described tribes as completely cut off from rest of the society, as isolated groups, and this was described in terms of their mobility as well as their lifestyle. So, the kind of dress, the kind of lifestyle, the kind of food that they used to consume, all this facilitated a particular kind of understanding for the colonial state. Then also an imagined historical or social description as an aboriginal or a barbaric. Now, these two terms were repeatedly used in colonial historiography as well as in a number of writings, and the way they used to describe a tribal was not as as someone who was probably not leading a settled life, that's fine, he was leading life of a nomad, that's also fine, but to describe him as an aboriginal, someone who had not really emerged from the past, he was still stuck to the past. There was still some kind of backwardness that was attached to his persona, and also barbaric, because they were following techniques of hunting, food gathering, and they were quite robust, and they used to live in their natural forms in the wild areas. So all this made them use these very derogatory terms in order to differentiate between the tribals and the non-tribals. Whereas if you look at the history of the colonial state, the rulers were far more barbaric than rest of the population, with the kind of hatred and with the kind of violence that they had instigated. Now, during early 19th century was also another theme that was developing, was that the tribals were largely being considered as troublemakers during early 19th century because of a series of rebellions that I had spoken about in the last lecture. For example, the Coal rebellion, the Bhumij uprising, then the Munda uprising during 19th century, and a series of other Santhal revolt, Sardari agitation. So all these agitations made the colonial regime adopt a very rigid stance towards the tribal population, as if they were the ones who were always making some kind of a trouble, some kind or the other of trouble against the colonial regime, and they were not really able to understand the kind of administrative revenue system that had been introduced in their areas. So therefore, they were increasingly described as raiders, as marauders, as robbers, bandits, and they were also some of them were also categorized as having belonged to criminal castes and tribes. So therefore, with this kind of labeling, that is the criminal castes and tribes versus rest of the population who was more law abiding, a particular kind of role model for an ideal citizen was being created. And by mid 19th century, a number of new ideas started emerging, and these ideas again brought about a change in the outlook of the colonial regime towards the tribals. Now, till middle of 19th century, the wider perspective towards tribals was that they were probably barbaric and they needed to be civilized, and this was the task that the colonial state had taken over, and they were definitely going to civilize them. But from mid 19th century onwards, the change that came in the mentality was to look at tribals as noble savage. So they were savage, they were not civilized, but then they were noble, they were not wicked, they were not someone who could not be cultivated, who could not be improved upon. So therefore, with this new ideology that was taking shape, and especially after the revolt of 1857, when there was a change in the attitude, in the sense that there was now an open proclamation that no more interference in the in the social system that was prevalent in India, or no more aggressionist policy, no more annexationist policy that would be followed towards the rest of the Indian states. So this new policy came with an elan, and there was now an attempt to bring over more and more tribal areas into confidence, to win over their confidence, and also at the same time to expand in their regions in order to fully gain control of the resources. So therefore, these groups were now seen by the colonial officials as a problem to be solved. So, it was not as if the problem did not exist, but then now the colonial officials wanted to solve the problem once and for all, so that sometime in near future the revolt of 1857 kind of a situation does not happen again, and all those pockets which could have caused unrest in future must be taken care of, and whether this was through more rigid colonial legislation or by following some kind of conducive policies by taking into consideration the tribal demands wherever possible. So, therefore, now there was more or less the difference that one can see in the earlier approach and this post 1857 approach was that the colonial state took upon itself the task of developing not only Christianity by also mobilizing more and more tribals to get converted, but also by starting new kind of education system in the tribal areas, so that they could be exposed to not only evangelicals, but they could also be exposed to the new medical services that the colonial state could offer, and also they could be provided with better schools, or there were some tribal areas where there was no schooling at all for several kilometers, because tribal areas had a very specific kind of education system which was known as the Dhumkuria, which was again an indigenous kind of a training, and there were dormitories where the tribal youth were trained in the art of warfare, or they were trained in a number of other skills like hunting, etc. Now, with the coming in of the new administrative system, with the new land revenue system, the colonial state needed people who could be employed at the lower rung of the administration, and it was not possible to bring the entire state machinery from the outside. So, therefore, it was important to kind of train the local population, and it was also important to make them more aware of the new ways of life, so that the British rule could exercise its authority with greater ease in these areas. Otherwise, it was very difficult for them to introduce the new legislation that they had always wanted to introduce in these areas. So, therefore, with this attitude and with this new changed vision, there was now more and more emphasis on starting medical dispensaries and also on starting schooling in the tribal areas, and also giving a chance to the missionaries to start their campaign, to start the evangelical mission in these areas, so as to bring about a change in the outlook of the tribals. So, having discussed these points, I shall now take a break and then resume in near future. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break, and we promise to give you more and more of the content. Till then, keep watching us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking about colonial policies towards the tribal and pastoral nomads, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Shruti Vip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Now I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Shruti Vip once again and would request her to continue further. Hello ma'am, welcome back.
Thanks a lot. So we were discussing a shift in the colonial policy towards the tribals and how from second half of 19th century they began to be described more in romanticized terms, and the term noble savage sums up this changing attitude, that they were considered still uncivilized but as noble, someone who could be relied on, who had a great soul, and if worked upon they could be changed. So, the reason this change in attitude was that now the colonial state wanted to employ them in the army, and this was also the time when the martial race theory was was influencing the colonial mindset, and therefore they were now looking at those ethnic groups in India who could be considered as brave and who had characteristics and traits of bravery, and they could be employed in the colonial army. So therefore the tribal groups like Bhils and Afghans were now romanticized as great warriors, as strong people, and there was great admiration for their hunting skills, for their sportsmanship, and this martial races theory projected tribals as manly and warrior like, unlike peasants who were considered as laid back, as not as brave, but as meek and passive. So therefore definitely soldiers could not be selected from such groups. Soldiers could only be selected from groups which were brave and strong enough, and they had a history of such strength to prove of. So therefore new policies were gradually being employed to include a large number of Bhils and Afghans into the colonial army, and this change attitude partly had an important role to play in bringing about a change towards the tribals. Then another important development was the paternalistic attitudes towards the population, and especially towards the tribals, because it was considered that it was the duty of the Britishers, it was the duty of the what you called white man's burden. It was their duty to bring about a change and modernization in the country, and therefore the deprived and the so called backward sections of society must not be left untouched, and in fact special initiatives must be undertaken in such areas so as to the Europeans are able to perform their duty properly. So therefore tribals came to be seen as brave but childlike. Childlike means that they were innocent and they could be taken in for a ride. So therefore it was important to always be on the guard and to make them completely dependent on the colonial regime, to make them silent supporters of the Raj, and therefore to make the colonial rule imperative for them, to project colonial rule imperative for them, because these tribals were not worldly wise, since they were leading an isolated life, and therefore it was the duty of the state, it was the duty of the Raj to convert them from savage to balanced individuals. So, therefore, now there was a lot of influence of colonial attitudes on Indian reformers also, as one can see from the account of a number of reformers during 19th century, and in fact most of the reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and a number of other reformers, they just forgot the past history of the interaction between the tribals and the non-tribals. And in fact, the new religious reform movements, they attempted to reclaim tribal groups with more and this was not to bring about a change in their lives, but because they had concerns about missionary activities that were being conducted by the Christian groups in the tribal areas. So, therefore, a number of reformers and reform movements started laying claims to these tribal areas during 19th century as part of their wider campaign against the colonial interference in Indian social values. So, therefore, the values of the new nationalist groups and also a number of reformers, both Hindu as well as Islamic reformers, their insistence on sobriety, on hard works, on mainstream religious values, which were incompatible with the belief systems of nomadic and tribal groups, largely explains that how these reformers wanted to utilize the themes of their particular religion and their particular social norms that they were fighting for to the complete annihilance and to the complete neglect of very peculiar socio-cultural systems that were prevalent in the tribal areas. And also the growing population pressure, the teeming millions were also bringing about lot of pressure on the tribal areas, and therefore, this was also one of the reasons that why the settled population was entering into greater conflicts with the tribals, because there was definitely they were eyeing the resources that were there in the tribal areas. Now, having discussed these various themes, now we come to the another very important theme, and that is the tribal situation in India. Now, we have discussed at length as to what was the colonial policy and how there was a change in that policy, but then again the reason behind that change was not philanthropy, but the reason was that they needed to employ particular sections of Indian society into army, and also there were strategic reasons. Now, let us briefly have a look on what is the tribal situation in India in the present context, and what changes have really come about. Now, if we talk about the present situation, tribals inhabit areas which are very rich in minerals, water resources and a number of other resources, mines, etc. And these are the resources, these are the those very resources which both the state as well as the non-state institutions, the private corporations are always looking for, and therefore, they are always on lookout for these resources for development of the economy and also for their own profit maximization. So, this is the basic contradiction that one of the most underdeveloped community of the country is staying in areas which are the richest in terms of resources. So, 90% of the coal and 50% of the remaining minerals are found in the tribal areas, and due to this influx of resources in tribal areas, tribals are frequently uprooted from their traditional habitat in name of the development. So, therefore, while development is going on the one hand for the nation as a whole or for rest of the population, but to facilitate this development, the sad part is that the tribals have to get uprooted. They are devoid of rights over their traditional habitat, and then they are not adequately compensated. And even if they are adequately compensated in the eyes of law, the emotional loss that they experience is unexplained for. Then the tribal people, who constituted almost 8% of the total population in India in 2001 census, accounted for 50% of the total displaced persons due to development projects. So, again this is worth discussing, that while it is only 8% of the population that the tribals constitute, but if you take into account the total number of persons who are displaced in the country due to any reason, especially due to development projects, it is none other than the tribals. So, this is a huge number, and this shows that how unjust and cruel the system has been towards the tribals, and this is largely a result of post globalization, post neoliberal policies that began after 1990s, and with the rising privatization, urbanization and neoliberalization, the trend is only increasing day by day, and there has been no break to this process of eviction from traditional habitats. Now, coming to the issue of tribals and forests, both these are very interrelated terms. In fact, they can be also considered as synonyms, because tribals without forests are nothing, and forests have traditionally been associated with tribals. In fact, 65% of the forest cover is in 187 tribal dominated districts of India, and out of 50 districts which have dense forest cover, 49 are tribal districts. So, these 49 tribal districts, you can well imagine how important forests is towards their lifestyle. Now, approximately 260 million people live below poverty line, out of which 100 million are partially or wholly dependent on forests, and out of which 70 million are tribals. So, again you can see that people who are living below poverty line are invariably tribals, as you can see from this data that I have shared with you. Then, out of the total number of forest fringe village areas of the country, 60% belongs to the central Indian states. So, almost 60% of the forest fringe villages, that is those villages which are located around or near bordering the areas of the tribal forests. Again, central Indian states are the most important as far as this number is concerned. And this again is because of greater influx, greater availability of forest areas in these states. Now, coming to the issue of tribals dependence on the forests and what is gradually happening, which is not really respecting this dependence on the forests. So, more than half of the population of Orissa, for example, is dependent on forests, who constitute about 60% of the total villages. So, this is a huge number, and unless and until there is a tribal friendly policy that is followed, and the policy should be such that in name of conservation or in name of development, these tribals should not be evicted from their areas. The forest produces which support tribals for more than 6 to 8 months a year are also very important subsistence base for the tribals, and they not only bring subsistence but also cash benefit, and therefore it is very important for the crucial subsistence and development of the tribal areas. So, in name of industrialization or development, if these forest areas are cleared and they are this area is put into a different kind of a land use, then definitely it would be a loss for the tribals. Then studies have also established that forest produces supplement almost 40% of the income of the tribals. Since most of the tribals are not indulging in settled agricultural life, they are very much dependent on gathering important herbs and other items from the forests, and this activity in fact constitutes 40% of their income, which is a very important part of their income, and therefore the state must devise ways and means that this part of the income does not get eroded. Having discussed these important aspects of how the tribals are dependent on forests, let us look at the post independence shifts as to what are the changes that have come about after 1947, and have there been significant tactical shifts, or more or less the policy of protection and conservation that the colonial state had started with a very myopic view still continues. So, therefore, talking about constitution retains the colonial centralized structure of the Government of India Act 1935, also the Indian Forests Act, Land Acquisition Act, Indian Penal Code, Criminal Procedure Code, all these have been retained. Then the fundamental rights and enabling legal entitlements have to be secured through expensive litigation. So, while the fundamental rights have been provided, they clearly cannot be exercised unless and until the tribals have recourse to cheap legal help, and in absence of such legal help, definitely their issues will remain unresolved and they would continue to suffer. Then also another problem has been that the state has been endowed with extensive powers, and these extensive state powers invariably clash with the rights of the tribals from time to time, and in fact they clash with the very existence of the tribals, and this has resulted in a series of protests from 1947 onwards. Now, another important discussion point is the fifth schedule. The fifth schedule basically talks about the provisions which forbids transfer of tribal lands to non-tribals. Now, this is a very important part of the constitution, the fifth schedule of the constitution, which lays down certain rules and regulations about the tribal areas in order to protect these areas from getting in out of the hands of the tribal areas into the hands of the non-tribals, and this fifth schedule is applicable in 9 states in the eastern, central, western, northern and southern India, because tribals are found in all these parts of the country. So, therefore, many state and central governments have been trying to amend the laws prescribed under the fifth schedule, because fifth schedule is a stumbling block to the development that the state wants to undertake in the tribal areas, and by development one can talk about mining, one can talk about harnessing water resources, energy resources, etc., and also timber. Now, why both the state and the central governments want to bring about a change in the fifth schedule is that unless and until a change is brought about, the resources that are there in abundance in the tribal areas cannot really be exploited, and therefore it is not only the government but also the private and the corporate sector which wants that change should come about in the 5th schedule, so that the tribal and the forest areas can be fully made use of. Now, in violation of the 5th schedule also many things are happening. For example, private mining has been going unabated in a number of tribal areas like Chhattisgarh, Orissa, Jharkhand, MP, etc. And there has been a long standing struggle and a demand by the tribals to end such illegal mining activity, because this is not only hampering their right to life, but it is also hampering their right to the forests. So, therefore, this is something which must be taken care of, and any change in the constitution in name of development or in name of harnessing the resources must take into account the rights of indigenous people as well. Now, coming to the 6th schedule, which has resulted in autonomous district councils with extensive fiscal and administrative powers. This is again applicable in the states of the north east. Now, this is basically in order to empower the tribal areas so as to incorporate the principle of local administration with greater emphasis. Now, while these schedules have been devised and incorporated in the constitution, the problem is the denial of tribal rights and the lands that are taken over without proper procedure. So, while on the one hand these schedules are very much on paper, they are there, but on the other hand the ground reality is that tribals are gradually being evicted without taking recourse to proper procedure. So, therefore, the settlement in and this again has been a trend that had continued from colonial period itself. So, for example, after independence or even before that, when the settlement was being mooted with the princely states and how the princely states would be incorporated in the independent India, many of the tribal communities that were living in these princely states were dispossessed, and there was always a problem of forest villages that I have already explained. Then the encroachments into revenue, common lands and forest lands, as well as the issue of regularization, because the idea of common lands and forest lands is was very basic and central to the very existence of tribal community, which basically is communal ownership of the resources. That is, not one particular individual owns the land or the forest or the water body, rather it is shared and enjoyed by the larger community at hand. But when dispossession takes place, no reference is made to or no consideration is shown towards the communal ownership of such areas. Then also the fact has been that there has been displacement due to a number of development projects. Again, this has become part and parcel of the development projects after 1947, and again malfunctioning of social and development sector. So, while on the one hand economic development, upliftment and a lot of attention is being paid to bringing about industrialization, etc., but another very important factor that should have been part and parcel of the entire development agenda, that is the social sector and the development sector, has largely been neglected, and this has resulted in greater poverty and greater marginalization of the already marginalized groups, whether it is lower castes or tribes. Then another sad part of the story has been the malfunctioning of a number of development projects. So, it is not as if the development projects have not been there. They have been incorporated in the planning process from time to time, but then they have not really functioned up to the mark, again due to corruption, due to bribery, and due to so many other socio-cultural political factors. So, therefore, if one talks about some such programs like the tribal sub-plan, which was introduced in 1975 in order to target the tribal areas. This sub-plan was introduced specifically to bring about holistic growth and development in the country by targeting especially those areas which had continued to remain underdeveloped and they needed specific attention of the state. So, therefore, tribal sub-plan 1975 has a very important role to play, but again the problem was the neglect of dry land agriculture in the upper watersheds, and this problem was not sadly taken up in a positive manner during this plan. Then another problem was the unsuitability of packages. So, the packages that were handed over or that were devised were not really conducive to the issues that were faced by the tribals, and therefore, again it was a top down approach rather than bottom up approach that could have made a difference. Then unsuitability of education, the kind of new education system that was being superimposed on the tribal areas without really taking into account what were their demands, what were their needs, and how the education could have been more practical oriented and could have been more related to the issues and demands of the hostile terrain or of the environmental demands and exigencies. This was not really taken care of. So, education again continued as a very superficial kind of a development agenda, and again irrationality of health services, because the kind of trends that were planned or the kind of programs that were initiated were largely similar to the kind of ones that were operating in non-tribal areas, whereas the demands and exigencies of the tribal areas were completely different. So, therefore, the tribal sub-plan had great hopes and aspirations, but then very few were achieved due to these realities and problems that were there at the ground level. Then another issue that continues to impact tribal existence is the legal bottlenecks. In fact, the basic liberal democratic rights cannot really be experienced by the tribals easily, again due to what I just said, expensive litigation, due to travel costs, due to their their being unaware of the processes that are at work, and therefore, the non-implementation of Atrocities Act, Usury Acts, restoration of alienated land provision, all these have remained largely unutilized, and also there are conflicting laws and policies. So, while the laws are very much there to protect the tribals, but the policy of development, developing resources which are there in the tribal areas works in the opposite direction, and therefore, there is no uniformity in the laws and the implementation process, and the result is the denial of basic livelihood also to the tribals. Now, having discussed these important points, I shall now take a break and continue with the topic in the next lecture. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to write to us at info.cec@nic.in if you have any queries or feedback for this particular lecture. All the lectures pertaining to the series are there for you on YouTube. So, keep watching us and keep writing us. We are going to meet again very soon and would be discussing more. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.
Thank you.